So this was about 6 years ago, around January, I believe. I was with two lifelong friends. We decided to go do something before we all shipped off to the military. I was going to be the first to ship out a few months after this. We started off hanging out at one friend's grandma's house. We eventually got bored and drove down to this river kind of back in the mountains in WV. So the way this is set up, we had the road up the hill, then a small patch of woods to walk through, probably 20 meters of woods. Then it opened up to a railroad track. Below the railroad track, down a steep gravel hill, was the riverbank. So, it was dark. We parked the car on the road and walked down to the river crossing the railroad. We didn't really have a plan. We just built a small fire on the riverbank and sat around repeating inside jokes and laughing about dumb stuff we did when we were younger. We couldn't have been there longer than 15 minutes when we heard a man yelling. Though we couldn't make out any words, the yelling sounded like he was yelling in a defensive manner. So we looked around and couldn't see anything. We heard it again and decided to stomp out the fire and sit there quietly and listen. After a few minutes go by, we decided to leave. So we made our way up the steep, so steep we basically had to crawl up it, gravel hill to the railroad tracks. We got to the top where we were about to cross the tracks, but we heard the sound of an engine getting closer. We decided to get on our bellies and wait the train out. We didn't want to get caught on railroad property because it's a no trespass area. Anyways, we seen lights coming and even seen smoke coming from the engine. Weird since they don't use steam engines anymore. But we thought nothing of it and kept waiting. We waited for maybe 30 seconds to a minute when we heard the same noise from earlier. We looked around again and seen nothing. When we turned back, the train was no longer headed toward us. It was just gone. We seen that it was clear and just crossed the tracks, went back up the hill through the woods, and just slept in the car. We ended up leaving in the morning and never really thought much of it. Then the next evening, we finally brought up how weird it was that a whole entire train just disappeared, and we questioned why we just didn't leave. Fast forward to 3 years later, I was in the military at this point and was back home in West Virginia for leave. I went to a bookstore with my dad and brother, and I went to the horror section. I seen a subsection with local books. I picked up one that was called something along the lines of West Virginia Legends. I don't remember the exact title. I flipped past a few pages and landed on one section called Ghost Trains in West Virginia. I immediately closed the book and sat it down. Weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life, and we still talk about it to this day. And I really don't know why we thought nothing of it until the next day, because that was extremely weird. Also, note that the way this particular track was set up, the way it ran was parallel to the river and the road going around the mountain. There was no fork in the tracks, and it could not have turned anywhere due to being right in between a road mountain and a river. Let me know what you guys think. I'm not really sure how a train could be a ghost. I sent this into a paranormal podcast, and they said we could have been in a time slip. I don't really know. I'm not super into paranormal stuff, but would love to hear some opinions about what you guys think it could have been. A few years ago, I was a university student in Eastern Washington, but dating a girl in Western Washington. I was visiting her for the weekend during the summer when we got into a huge fight around midnight and I left, deciding to head back to my apartment. I mention this for context as to why I was driving through Snoqualmie Pass after 1 in the morning. I'd never gone through the pass so late before, and what is usually a very busy stretch of freeway on I-90 was completely empty. I went well over an hour without seeing a single vehicle going either way, so naturally, I was driving way too fast. At the time, I had a '73 Chevy Nova. It wasn't quite the classic, but it had power and a complete lack of AC. Even though it was late at night, the combination of a warm summer night and the large amount of heat that bleeds through from the engine meant that I had my windows down and was sweating. Not far into the east side of the mountains, around 1:30, I hit a long stretch of state road that doesn't have an on-ramp or any way to get into the freeway, when suddenly a set of headlights appeared behind me something like 200 feet back. I glanced back at the lights, puzzled as to where the vehicle could have possibly come from. I noticed that despite the fact that I was absolutely hauling, the lights were gaining on me. I decided to switch lanes and slow down a bit so it could pass. After a moment, the vehicle, now only half that distance, moved over behind me into the same lane. This is when I began to panic. I'm in the middle of nowhere, hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour, and now I've got some aggressive driver running up on me. I watched as those lights got closer. 60 feet, 50 feet, 40 feet. In seconds it was upon me. I braced against the steering wheel, expecting to get rear-ended by a vehicle going much faster than me now. I watched in my rear-view mirror in horror as those headlights blasted right into the back of my vehicle, and suddenly everything froze. Quite literally. Nothing physically hit me, but the whole vehicle frosted over and I could see my breath. I hit the brakes and did my best to pull over, despite not being able to see through the windshield. Every hair on my body was standing on end. I got out of my vehicle and paced back and forth, examining my car, which was already starting to defrost as streams of water poured down it. There was no damage to my back bumper, and absolutely no sign of whatever vehicle had hit me. Eventually, I calmed down enough to get back in the car and drive the rest of the way back, wake my roommates, and explain what had just happened. The next time I drove through the area in the daylight, right about where I think the ghost car had hit me, there was a very old wooden cross somewhat overgrown on the side of the road. As to the location of the cross, I have a few points I'd like to make. The first is that this was years ago, and so I do not remember the exact location. The cross itself was difficult to spot. It was very washed-out wood. It had clearly had writing on it at one time, but it wasn't legible going 70 miles per hour, and there is virtually no shoulder to speak of for pulling over. I spotted the cross several times over the next year, but in my last year living on the east side, I don't recall seeing it anymore. I cannot say with any certainty if it is still there or not, but my gut tells me it's been torn down by the weather and nature. I did attempt to look up any deaths along there and found almost too many stories with no exact locations. I eventually decided that I wouldn't have any real way to determine which one it could be. But I was telling a friend about my experience one night while at the Iron Horse Brewery in Ellensburg, and a random older gentleman on the other side of me piped in that he'd seen it before too. He then finished his drink and left, visibly upset. My grandmother had recently passed away, and we went back in our hometown house, which was totally a rural area. Electricity was frequently out, and my aunts and cousins living there drank water from wells and stuff. We went there to perform the rituals that involved in her funeral. I loved her the most than anyone, and while taking her last breaths, she wanted to see me one last time. But I was in the city, and couldn't get to our hometown any soon. I was devastated when I heard her last wish to see me. After 2 years, I visited my hometown again, and one night the electricity went out, and my cousins and aunties were all sitting in the backyard at night talking to each other. And that's when my aunt asked me and my cousin's sister to light up the lamp which was inside the storeroom, and the storeroom was beside kitchen. My hometown is a really rural area. The houses were made up of old bricks, and some walls were falling off. I went inside the house with my cousin's sister. As I went in the storeroom with a small torchlight, I started searching for the lamp. After a few minutes, I found it in the corner of the storeroom as I went to pick it up. I saw a shadow of someone moving behind me due to the torchlight facing the wall. I could see the movement clearly on the wall in front of me. And the shadow Elle saw was a little bended over, which was same to the way my grandmother used to walk as she had back injury. I thought my cousin's sister was pulling a prank on me, so I laughed and told her to stop. But the shadow moved again, and this time I looked back to tell my cousin to stop. But as I moved, the shadow moved behind me. I turned where the shadow was, but again it moved behind me. It was like it was standing behind me every time I moved in any direction. At this point, I started doubting that was it really my cousin, but I shouted at her to stop it and laughed. I tried to pick up the lamp from the floor, but its handle was stuck under something. So after a few seconds of pulling it, I got tired and called my cousin's sister to help me out as I thought she was the shadow. I shouted her name, but she didn't answer me back, so I picked up Torch, which was lying on the floor, as Elle turned around. There was no one in the room. I got frustrated with my cousin for leaving me alone in the room and went outside in the yard where I saw my sister sitting with my other cousins and aunties. I yelled at her for the prank she pulled and left the room without saying anything. My cousin's sister looked really confused and said that she never in the first place went in the storeroom with me. Instead, she was in the kitchen to get the matchbox for lighting the lamp and showed me the matchbox. I thought she was lying, but my other cousins and aunties told me that my sister came back in the yard. After a few seconds, we went in. After that night, I couldn't think properly and eventually got a high fever the next morning. My aunties and cousins would have said if they were pranking me, as I got sick really bad and needed to go to hospital. Till this day, I still question myself. Was it really my grandmother's spirit who wanted to meet me, or was it all my imagination? My house is a long strip of living room to hallway to the end where my bedroom lie. The way my bed's set, when I lay on one side, I face a corner, but when I lay the other way, I can see perfectly at my door. If the door is open though, I can see all the way through my house to other end of the living room with the fireplace. I'd say the distance from my bed to the fireplace was about 40-50 feet, and my bed to the end of the hallway was probably 20 feet. The only thing I could hear was the small grandfather clock tick on the shelf in the living room, with a few chimes every 15 minutes. It was a very quiet night in the year 2005, when I experienced an odd occurrence that I still to this day have never seen anything like it again. I was sleeping with the door open, as I did because I was 5 and did not like to be cut off from the rest of the house for a fear of being alone. My mom's bedroom door was to the left, looking out my room, and was perpendicular, with my brother's being the same but on the right. I was woken up in the middle of the night for no particular reason and was facing the corner of my room. I noticed I could not really fall back asleep, so I tried turning to my other side to see if that might be more comfortable to fall asleep. Once I do, I noticed something almost immediately. I saw a dark figure standing a few feet from the end of the hallway into the living room. The figure was very tall, being about 6 feet or more. It was hunched over very slightly to its right and was very still. No one in the house at the time was that tall, and so I was curious on who it could be. I wanted to be brave and wave to see if I was just seeing something, but with no movement or response. I slowly uncovered myself and stood up and walked over through my door. I took my time making my way down the hall, passing my mom and brother's room and the bathroom door in the middle of the hallway. The figure never changed, still a dark figure at the same height and shape, until I finally got close enough to panic, as it still had not moved and was towering over me about 6 or 7 feet away from me. I knew there was a light switch just to the left of the end of the hall around the corner, which I scrambled to flip on. I got it, which turned on the dining room light just to the left, and the light poured through the wide doorway and illuminated part of the living room it was connected to. The figure was lit up. To my surprise, it was just a standing vacuum. Relieved, I look around the vacuum and then shrug it off and turn the light off and go lay in bed. Once I start to lay down and turn over to face the hallway again, I can see the vacuum outline perfectly, skinnier and shorter than the figure I thought I saw earlier, which has made me wonder ever since. How come a figure that was 6 feet tall and was perfectly made out to be a person suddenly become a vacuum at my height, at 5 years old, and smaller to be the outline of a vacuum now? Being a person of deductive reasoning, I can only figure it could be my eyes possibly adjusting from dark to light to dark again, but even then, the figure never returned even later in the night. Now, something that might fuel this story is that my mom's boyfriend actually killed himself around the time of my 1st or 2nd birthday, while no one was home. I asked my mom later how tall he was. Turns out he was just a bit taller than 6 feet, as he was tall. Do I think it was a ghost? Not sure. But do I think if it was a ghost, it was him? Yes. My Meemaw was a nurse. She started in the Cadet Nurse Corps during World War II. After the war, she became an RN and spent the next 12 years working at her local hospital, mostly on the cardiac floor, but other parts too, if they needed her. She loved her job, but something bad happened with one of the doctors she worked under, and she saw no choice but to move on to elsewhere. Her next job was at a long-term care facility, a nursing home to the uninitiated, where she worked for a lot of years until her retirement. My papa died before I was even thought of, so I never knew him outside of pictures and the stories my mama told me. Mama didn't say much about him, but she never minded mama talking about him. A few years after he passed, Mama met a lady who waitressed at her favorite restaurant, Clovey, and Mama and Clovey lived together for the rest of Mama's life. Due to the times and it being the very Baptist South, everyone understood, but still, they were roommates. They did very well and kept the little farm my Mima and Papa had bought in the family. They were even able to hire farmhands so they could both focus mostly on their own careers. Mama had a lot of stories about strange goings-on at the hospital and at the nursing home. Even some she mentioned existed but said she'd never repeat. I'd like to share one now that touched my heart a bit, so if you're looking for something terrifying, this'll probably be boring for you. This one happened at the nursing home where she worked, and she was in her early 30s at the time. They had a resident, a man named Thomas. Thomas could talk, but usually didn't. He was a slow-moving man who liked to wheel himself around and be at least an hour early to any meal or activity. He couldn't dress himself or tell you if he needed to pee or not, and she would laugh and tell about how she'd have to change his pants at least once per shift, because she could never quite get his toileting schedule down, and he had what she called a 5-gallon drum for a bladder. Thomas had 2 bird feeders his kids had put outside his window. They'd bring a new 7-pound bag of birdseed almost every visit with no regard for how much was already in his closet. At first, the maintenance guys took on the bird feeder responsibility, but after a few months, they decided they didn't have time and wouldn't be doing it anymore. One of the nurse's aides that worked with Mima, Nellie, decided she'd take up the cause. So anytime Thomas's bird feeders got low, she'd bring his bag of birdseed out and refill them. Thomas would get a little down when he couldn't watch his birds at the feeders, so when Nellie took on the responsibility, everyone was glad to see him perk back up. Nellie took this seriously and never let those bird feeders run out. Mama said she was a very sweet young woman and seemed to love nothing more than doing that little something extra to make the residents happy. She was reliable, always a few minutes early to her shift, and always happy to help her residents and her co-workers. And as my Mima always pointed out at this part of the story, the good die young. Nellie was only 23 when a drunk driver hit her head-on as she was on her way home, having stopped off at the grocery store after her shift. It was bad enough to be a closed-casket funeral. But according to Mima, Nellie wasn't really gone. After a week or so, one of the nurses pointed out that they should probably refill the bird feeders, because they'd have to be empty by now. They sent Nellie's replacement, Joanne, to get it taken care of. But Joanne looked out Thomas's window and returned to let them know that they were already full. And every time anyone checked, that was the case. No one took ownership of having filled them. They even asked the night shift folks, the administration, and the maintenance team that had refused to continue taking care of it to begin with. Eventually, they all started to joke that it must be Nellie's spirit taking care of Thomas's bird feeders. About 8 months after Nellie's death, Thomas died from a severe case of being 99 years old. His kids decided they'd donate the bird feeders and leave them where they were, and they left the bird seed in his closet. The feeders kept on getting filled, and still, no one would take the credit for it. It wasn't long before a new resident moved into Thomas's room, and she enjoyed the bird feeders outside the window as well. But without Thomas's kids constantly restocking the seed, the supply in the closet eventually ran out. That's when the closet door started misbehaving. The new resident would often complain that her closet door must be broken, because it would open and close on its own, sometimes really hard. The staff had no trouble believing it because it was a loud slamming. Then a couple of housekeepers complained that anytime they hung the new resident's laundry in the closet, the door would slam shut again before they could close it themselves. One said that she was just mopping on the other side of the room when the door threw itself open and then shut. Before long, almost everyone working there had witnessed this closet door banging open or shut with no one's assistance. They all seemed to find it interesting and novel at first, but before long everyone was pretty annoyed with it. Mama said a few of them went into the room and asked Nellie or Thomas to please stop, and the reply was always the door slamming itself open or closed, sometimes in rapid succession. They even called a preacher at one point to pray, but even he was met with only the slamming closet door for all his efforts. They moved the new resident out of the room because she wasn't able to rest for that door. Then one day, my Mima and one of her fellow nurses were chatting about that closet door over their lunch, and it occurred to them that the big change was the lack of birdseed in the closet to keep the feeders filled. After work that day, Mama stopped on her way home and bought a bag, and the next day she opened it up and put it in that closet. Sure enough, the closet didn't open or close on its own, and the bird feeders were refilled regularly. As an experiment, they let the new bag run out and didn't replace it at first. The closet door started back to misbehaving, and when they put a new bag of birdseed in, all was quiet. From then on, they all took turns making sure the supply never ran out, and they never had to hear the slamming closet door again. The feeders would be full and no one knew how, but any resident who lived in that room after always had 2 full feeders and birds outside their window.